Well, yeah, LA is based in Skid Row. I mean, LAPD is based in Skid Row, Los Angeles, and it's a it's a it's a it's a spot. We actually now have a little museum called the Skid Row History Museum and Archive, and the first show we did there, which was this March, was it had two planning documents from the '70s. And Skid Row is right next to the high-rise downtown. So if you watch car commercials or soap operas or stuff, you've probably seen like the Bonaventure, which is round towers and different kinds of things. So within a 10 minutes walk east of that is Skid Row, or 15 minutes. And in the 50s and 60s anyway, the downtown business district became fairly abandoned, and they decided to do urban renewal. Like the mayor really convened a bunch of business players, and they wrote up this plan, and they did urban renewal on Bunker Hill. So that entire skyline you see used to be a residential neighborhood. It had first been old Victorian houses for actually wealthy people who were working downtown, 100 years ago, and then they became boarding houses and other apartments were built. It was a really sweet place, actually, but it was completely leveled in this urban renewal. So all the property was taken out of private hands and small player hands and consolidated in big player hands, and these big towers came up. So the next thing they wanted to do was to extend this east, which would have included Skid Row, and so another plan was developed, which is what we had in our little museum space, which was to miraculously disappear the housing in Skid Row. And at that time, Skid Row, like I said, there have always been a lot of day laborers living there, and then there were a lot of retirees living all over downtown, actually in hotels that were being systematically knocked down, either during the urban renewal or in adjacent areas. And then there were a lot of elderly people and some people with so-called alcohol problems living in Skid Row, and the development plan was part two, which is known as the Silver Book. The plan was to sort of consolidate services for those people in the 3-block area, knock everything else down, rebuild it, and then miraculously any kind of social problems or poor people without resources would disappear, and without being displaced. That was the magic part of it. So anyway, that plan didn't go through because actually, well, it almost went through, and then actually moneyed interests in other parts of town didn't like the arrangement because they felt it was consolidating too many resources in downtown, and why not in their neighborhood? Because there were actually a lot of tax breaks connected with this redevelopment. So they felt like we should be getting those for our own development projects. And into that, so it became a contended thing, and into that gap, some really smart activists wrote up their own plan, and they gave it to everybody on this committee appointed by the mayor that was going to reconcile these two money player points of view. And because it was a plan that actually made sense, unlike the magical thinking of the other plan, the activists wrote their own plan for about 60 pages, was inserted wholesale into the final report for the other guys, for the mayor's plan. So it became the plan, and which mainly it designated the boundary of Skid Row, and it saved the housing within a 50-block area. The thing about it was no market rate development was allowed to happen in this area. And so unlike other places like the Bowery or practically anywhere else in the US, where what happens is once like rich people have a property in the same geography as poor people, then it becomes my neighborhood, and my neighborhood wants this, and my neighborhood wants that, and their voices, their dollar voices, mega dollar voices are what is heard. And so what's happened in Skid Row is a slightly anomalous situation, which is because those people haven't been able to build in that area. But a lot of housing has been restored by nonprofits. The community voices have really developed, and a lot of grassroots efforts, political efforts, and recovery efforts, and all kinds of stuff have come up that actually have a voice and are important in the neighborhood. So that's a really anomalous situation, I think. So it's made the neighborhood endure, and with a recognizable character and a certain amount of clout in its own behalf. I was living in New York in the '80s, up until '84 when I moved out here, and I was living in the East Village, but even there, which is pretty funky in downtown New York at that time. I mean, suddenly you were seeing a lot of people living on the street in 1983, '84, and you hadn't really seen so many people before. So I got interested in making a performance about that because at that time I was doing solo performances,
Right.
and then I was invited to do a collaboration with an architect and a visual artist, Lori Hawkinson and Erica Rothenberg, on a really alchemical project, which was they were taking on the west side of New York. They were taking dirty Hudson River water, pouring a lot of sand in it, and creating the World Financial Center and Battery Park City. So in other words, at that time, maybe the world's most expensive real estate. So it was a beautiful, like I said, alchemical project. So I thought I'd do something about homelessness on that site. Well, it was a sort of a sand dune while they were fighting environmental regulations, and that's where I was able to do something. So in researching that, I happened to be in LA right before the Olympics, and then I went to government hearings, and I ran into all these homeless activists and housed activists who were working together to testifying about the conditions of the government support for the people living in that area. So I started volunteering for them, and it was just really, really interesting and compelling. And so I kept going back there and helping organize different projects, including a massive tent city that happened across from City Hall over Christmas of that year, and then. In New York, I kept raising a little bit of money. So in the spring, I came out there for 4 or 5 months with enough money to stay for 4 or 5 months. Then I was offered a job by Inner City Law Center as a homeless advocate, helping people with cases and really running around all of LA County, seeing if what had been won in court around class action welfare cases was really being implemented or not, or whether it was being blown off. So So then I started doing workshops at the law center when people weren't there, so in the evening and on weekends. Because with the law center, I've written a grant to the California Arts Council. And so we pushed the desks out of the way and we, start doing stuff, And I didn't know how interesting this would be to folks, but some of the people I was working with already at the law center, passed out flyers, and a whole bunch of people showed up with a lot of work that they'd made of different kinds, but then had been underappreciated by the world. So they got to show one another all this stuff. And then ultimately we started making stuff together. I was mainly, following my nose, and trying to figure out what was possible with the group of people in the room. But that was no different, I guess, than the way, because I'd done a lot of improvisational stuff in New York, and so you're always just working with the people in the room, whoever those people are, in this case. So we were figuring out what we could do. And one fruitful thing was, since I was spending all my day in the welfare office, and a lot of other people were too, we usually had a lot of passion and frustration about that by the end of the day, so we could employ that in various ways. One thing we did at the beginning, which was really, we would do talent shows on the street, and we would give away fabulous prizes like $3, $5, and $7, $5, $7, and $10 or something. And we do talent shows for anybody who showed up on just any street corner. And so that was a way of recruiting for, people to get involved in the group, generally speaking. And but so we've always done, different kinds of things like that. We did a project where we put a phone booth out on the street. This was before the cell phone era, and in front of where we were workshopping, and people could call anywhere in the world for free. And to a loved one, that was the deal. They had to call a loved one, and they didn't have to tell us about it. But if they wanted to, they could come inside and have a donut and coffee and get involved in what we were doing. So we've always used the streets as a way of, as a way of recruiting people into what we're doing, and we've done some projects specifically about that. The walk the talk. Is particularly about celebrating people who've made community there over many years, and by doing something in front of the spot associated with them. And it's part of, it's in the context of making it clear that there is a neighborhood here, that people really have been living here and working here for 30 or 40 years, and that there is and a lot of important things have happened here, and because from the outside of the community, it's often still portrayed as a transient neighborhood, But in fact, it's a neighborhood where there are permanent residents and institutions that have developed to solve problems, For example, LAPD's done a lot of traveling projects too. So if we travel with 5 or 6 people and we're in a room somewhere doing something really weird, namely like some sort of theater stuff, with people who have never done it before, well, if there are 5 or 6 of us doing it, then people sort of think like, well, I guess this is something that people can do together, and so and on Skid Row, I think there's definitely that feeling, people. Sometimes people come in and they think it's really weird, but generally not. And it's really important to us to keep an open door policy. Sometimes even with like in one of our most recent shows, some of the people who we got in just off the street ended up having really big roles in that production. So we're always thinking about how to do that. Yeah, pretty much people can walk in at any rehearsal they want to.
Wow.
Then oftentimes, especially when people like when we did State of Incarceration, for example, when we did it in LA, it ended up having 18 people in it. And some people just had like one line, but since we were doing it in LA and we wanted those people just showed up, we want to keep them involved,
right.
Then they would be in the cast. So it depends a little bit on the project, but generally speaking, we're always inviting people in, and people, if you hang around, you're going to be in.
Brilliant.
Living in New York, I was I didn't go. I went to school. I studied philosophy, and then I later on I decided to hang out a shingle and make myself an artist, because you can in America if you're a preacher or an artist, you can just self-announce, and say the Church of John, So that's what I did, and but I didn't know, but then and this friend and I was doing street theater with some guys, and then this friend of mine and I started doing this improvisational stuff, and then another friend of ours who was art school trained, we thought we were doing experimental theater because my friend had been to theater school. And then another friend of ours who had gone to art school said, hey, what you guys are doing is performance art, and you should talk to this person and that person. So we did. So then we became we were performance artists. We did the same. We just did the same thing, but now we were performance artists. And then when I moved to LA, suddenly I was working with a lot of people, so I was a theater director. Because if it's a lot of people, then it's theater, I guess, So we've always we've always looked at it more in, it's not just about theater, but it's about, performance and other kinds of art stuff. And really, I think we have at least equally as much support, or maybe more, in sort of, especially now, because in the visual arts part of life than in the theater part of life, Because, but things go in waves, like things get discovered, get invented, and then they pass away, and other things. So now there's a lot of interest in the visual art side, in social practice, and so we are practitioners of social practice. It turns out,
Okay.
just like we were performance artists, and I was a theater director and all that stuff. So yeah, utopia and dystopia. Yeah, it was about. In 1999, I think the city passed an ordinance about that allowed them only in downtown to take former office properties and convert them into housing instead of loftization, and this was part of some developers who started developing a certain part of downtown right next to Skid Row. And so there's all this talk about urban pioneers and the new downtown and creating the world-class city and blah blah blah. So the utopia dystopia was about can you create utopia on the backs of suffering, causing other people to suffer and displacement. So that's what it was about. And in particular it was about it used we used some found text at that, meaning a very contentious hearing of the city council. So we used the words of we played the city council, we played the developers and all that. We just used their words and other stuff from the police chief and we looked into a lot of the issues that were going on right then. And the main one was about people's right to sleep on the streets and the aggressive policing that was going on to keep them from doing that. So and we coupled those found texts with with street research, where we went out with some pals of ours who are very important activists in Skid Row called the LA Community Action Network, and they had a project where they monitor the behavior of the police. So we went out with them and helped them monitor the behavior of the police, and found some behavior worth incorporating into the show, and then we did other kinds of stuff. Like we had some people who went and applied for lofts with real estate agents and stuff like that. So the show was built around these different kinds of research, street research and book research, and which included, like I said, these found texts from the city council and the mayor. And then, we did that show at Red Cat, which is probably the most well-known experimental theater in Los Angeles, and it's in the basement of Disney Hall, which is the iconic Frank Gehry building. So this created a lot of upset that lasted for many years, because we had done it in that location, I think. And but we also did that project had other aspects, and one was we did a series of conversations leading up to it in different venues, at a business and at the Japanese American Museum and different spaces of all kinds, where we invited people in our group and others from Skid Row to identify people who they thought were making the new town, doing something fabulous to make the new downtown, and then those people came and presented about what they were doing. So we had historic preservationists, street musicians, developers, activists. And then we asked those people to find new people. And so it just sort of spiraled out curatorially. And eventually we had a police detective and all kinds of people. And so people who were not at all aligned in what they saw about the future of downtown in a conversation in a slightly more neutral place than where those conversations usually happen, which are in hearing rooms and stuff like that. And also it included other nice things like films, and some people played music, and some people showed a movie, and some people played Korean flute and did Tai Chi and all kinds of stuff. And then we did another thing which was called 220 glimpses of utopia, because those those things were called Glimpses of Utopia. 1 through 7 was the first meeting, and then the next one was 7 through 14, blah, blah. We got to 35, and then we did 220 Glimpses of Utopia, which is a project where we convened people from the neighborhood and also people, a lot of high school and university students, in particular dance students from the campuses around LA, and we pondered utopia on outlets and workshops where we pondered utopia, and people came up with little movements that we then, in each workshop, that we then distilled into a movement phrase, and then those people, some of them were deputized to do other workshops with other community-based groups like the Downtown Women's Center or the Rotary House or whatever. So eventually we had like 220 people, and each group had their own movement phrase that incorporated a little bit of each person's movement into it. And then at 4:15 on a Friday afternoon, we lined up between Skid Row and City Hall, which is about 10 blocks, and we had people sort of like trees, so they weren't moving, they were like standing at intervals, and then for 20 minutes they just did these movements in silence, and it was a sort of a weird, unsettling, transformative intervention, and it also forged a bond, between people, like all the artists who can't afford, because artists, of course, became a marketing thing in the new downtown. So all the artist lofts, like most of the artists couldn't afford to be in artist lofts, and so we had this large group of artists who couldn't live in artist lofts but could participate in this project. I think arts funding is pretty insulated from the stuff that's in the direct hands of the politicians. Thank God, and so it actually makes it possible. We've been able to keep an independent voice and not have too many people trying to shut us down because they don't have the mechanisms to do it. We don't get funding directly from people who we think are who we call out on various issues. But there are other funding mechanisms that are available to us that are more independent, and this is a source of great frustration, I think, to the people that like to run the show. We have been, consistently funded by the California Arts Council. When, of course, there were a few years when they had no money and they weren't able to fund anything. The National Endowment for the Arts and the Cultural Affairs Department of the City of Los Angeles and the LA County Arts Commission. But all of those things together, those are things where you apply every year, or some have gotten every other year, and you get a certain amount of money if you're chosen. So you have to be chosen, and then you're ranked, and then you get a certain amount of money based on your rank against everybody else. And all those put together are not enough to be the core funding. Okay, they're not enough to be the core funding. So we're always needing to get funds from other from foundations and also from doing gigs or partnerships or something like that. We've always been, like I said, pretty much a shoestring operation, and it needed a lot of creativity just to survive. In terms of how are we going to keep it funded. So we were way ahead of hard times, and